The Duke pulled her from the snowstorm. What he did next shocked the Pope. The prayers did not save her. She had said enough of them, kneeling on stone floors in the dark until her knees bled and her faith wore thin as paper. 14 years inside convent walls had taught Niamh Breslin two things: how to be silent and how to survive. Tonight, the snow was testing both. She had been walking for 3 hours when her legs gave out. Not slowly. Not with warning. One moment she was moving through the white dark, the letter pressed flat against her ribs beneath her cloak, her breath coming in ragged clouds. The next, the ground rose up and met her, and the snow swallowed her at the knee, and she understood with a strange, quiet clarity that she was going to die here, in a Highland snowstorm, miles from anyone, with the only evidence that could clear her father's name still sealed against her heart. She almost laughed. She had escaped a locked room, climbed a garden wall in the dark, walked 3 miles in a killing frost, and it was the snow that would finish her. Not Rome. Not the men Rome had sent. Just the cold, indifferent Scottish winter, doing what cold, indifferent things do. Niamh pressed one palm into the snow and tried to rise. Her arm buckled. She tried again. The wind answered by driving a fist of ice into her face. She stopped trying. She was still deciding whether this counted as surrender when she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm. Footsteps. Deliberate. Heavy. Moving through the trees without hurry, the way a man moves when he is not afraid of what the dark contains, because he is the thing the dark contains. She turned her head. He came out of the tree lane like winter had grown a spine and learned to walk. Tall. Dark cloaked. A hood pulled low. Snowflakes settling on his shoulders as if they had been there long enough to consider themselves permanent. He stopped when he saw her. Said nothing. For one long moment he simply looked, the way a man looks at a problem he did not ask for and has not decided yet whether to solve. Then he moved. He crossed the snow in 4 strides, dropped to one knee beside her, and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. His hand was warm. The shock of it nearly made her weep. "You're alive," he said. His voice was low, undecorated, and entirely without comfort. The voice of a man stating a fact he finds mildly inconvenient. "Barely," Niamh said. He looked at her for another moment. Something shifted in his jaw, not softness, but decision. Then he slid one arm beneath her knees and lifted her from the snow as though she weighed no more than the storm itself. Niamh grabbed the front of his cloak with the last of her strength and tried to ask his name. Darkness took her first. When she opened her eyes again, she was lying before a fire in a stranger's mountain cabin, fever warm and half undone, her frozen cloak gone and a rough wool blanket pulled to her chin. The room was low-ceilinged, stone-walled, and smelled of wood smoke and something green and medicinal she could not name. Her fingers found the letter instinctively. Still there, tucked now inside her dress, and only then did she breathe. The man was sitting across the room in a high-backed chair, watching her. In the firelight, his face was all angles and shadow, the kind of face that had never once been called warm and had long since stopped caring. Dark hair. A jaw that looked like it had weathered things. Eyes that were some indeterminate color between gray and green, and currently as readable as granite. He said nothing. He did not look relieved that she had woken. He looked, if anything, like a man reconsidering a decision. Niamh opened her mouth. "Don't," he said, and stood and crossed to the hearth, and returned with a wooden cup that smelled of bitter herbs and winter bark. He held it out with the expression of a man who had never once offered comfort willingly and was not going to start performing it now. "Drink," he said. Then sleep. Questions in the morning. Niamh looked at the cup. Looked at him. "Who are you?" she asked anyway. The fire cracked between them. He did not answer. He simply held the cup closer, and waited, as though silence were a language he had been fluent in his entire life and had no intention of translating for her. She drank, because she had not the strength to do otherwise. Outside, the storm pressed its hands flat against the walls and howled. Asterisk. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. He had not meant to bring her inside. That was the part that irritated him most. Not the weight of her, not the detour, not the fire he would have to rebuild from nothing at this hour. It was the fact that he had looked at her lying in the snow and made a choice, and Rowan Calloway had not made an unguarded choice in 11 years. The cabin was a 20-minute walk through the trees. He made it in 14, her body carried against his chest, her frozen fingers still knotted around something beneath her cloak. He did not look at what it was. He kept his eyes on the path and his mind on the cold and told himself this was simple. She was a woman dying in the snow. He was a man with a roof and a fire. This required no further examination. The door opened with a shoulder. Inside, the dark was complete and the cold nearly as bad as outside. He laid her on the low cot nearest the hearth, and for a moment crouched over her, his hand near but not touching her face, reading the shallow climb and fall of her chest the way a man reads weather, looking for what it foretells. Her lips were gray at the edges. Her skin had the waxy translucence of someone very close to the place where warmth stops meaning anything. But she was breathing. Stubborn, that. He had the sudden, unwanted impression that she had been stubborn for a long time. He built the fire. He did not rush, because panic accomplished nothing and hypothermia cared nothing for urgency. Only for heat, sustained and patient. When the flames caught, he turned back to her and removed the cloak, and her boots, and the outer layer of her dress without ceremony or particular gentleness, working with the detached efficiency of a man accustomed to tending animals and injuries. He had done worse things in harsher conditions. He did not allow himself to find this remarkable. Her hand was the problem. Even unconscious, she would not release it. Whatever was pressed against her ribs, whatever she had curled her fingers around in those final yards before the snow took her. He could see the edge of it now. Paper. A sealed letter, by the look of it, folded flat and worn soft at the creases from being carried close for a long time. He looked at it for perhaps 3 seconds, noting the wax seal, noting the Latin characters pressed into it, noting the shape of the thing. Then he looked away. He covered her with a heavy wool blanket, set a pot of water to heat over the fire, and went to sit in the chair across the room. This was where a sensible man stayed. Not close enough to be a comfort she hadn't asked for. Not far enough to miss it if she stopped breathing. He watched her. The fire did its work. Color came back into her face by degrees, the gray retreating from her mouth, the rigid lines of cold beginning slowly to release their hold. Her fingers eventually loosened around the letter. Not entirely, but enough. As if some deep animal part of her had agreed, provisionally, to trust the warmth. He still did not read it. He was not a man who read other people's letters. He was not a man who asked questions he hadn't been invited to answer, or offered help he hadn't been asked to give, or brought half-dead women out of snowstorms and then pried open their secrets by firelight. He told himself all of this very clearly, sitting in the chair across the room. Outside, the storm settled in for the night, and showed no sign of leaving. Neither did he. The fever came for her properly on the second night. It announced itself with shivering, violent, full-body convulsions that rattled her teeth and pulled small sounds from her throat that she would have been ashamed of, had she been conscious enough for shame. Rowan heard it from across the cabin and set down the cup he was holding without looking to see where it landed. He had seen fever before. He knew what it wanted. It wanted stillness surrendered, warmth stolen, and, if you gave it long enough, breath. He didn't give it long enough. He built the fire higher than was sensible, dragged the cot closer to the hearth until he could feel the heat on his own face from 3 feet away, and went to work with the quiet efficiency of a man who has learned that panic is simply wasted motion. More blankets. The herb water kept warm in the small iron pot, yarrow and elderflower, things his housekeeper had taught him and he'd been faintly irritated to find he'd retained. He lifted Niamh's head and coaxed the liquid past her lips in small amounts, tilting the cup with the patience of someone who has nothing else to do and knows it. She was not a cooperative patient. In her fever she argued. Not with him, with someone he couldn't see. Latin, mostly, clipped and urgent, the kind of Latin that lived in convents and courtrooms and not in ordinary mouths. Once she said, "You have no authority here," with such cold precision that Rowan actually looked toward the door. Then her face crumpled like a child's, and she turned her head away and said much quieter, "Papa." He looked at her then. Really looked. She was younger than she'd first seemed, or perhaps illness had stripped something from her face that she normally kept there as armor. Her hair had come loose and dried in dark waves against the pillow. There was a cut above her left brow he hadn't noticed before, shallow but deliberate looking, as if she'd caught it on something in the dark while moving fast. Her hands, where they'd slipped free of the blanket, were not soft hands. There were rope calluses along the outer edge of the right palm, the kind you got from climbing or hauling or escaping. He tucked her hands back under the wool without letting himself think too much about any of it. On the morning of the second day, the shivering stopped. The fever didn't break so much as exhale, a long, slow release, the way a storm gentles before it finally quits. Her breathing steadied. The small sounds stopped. Rowan, who had been sitting in the chair beside the cot for he didn't know how many hours, felt something unknot in his chest that he refused to name. He made broth, boiled it down from the dried venison he kept on the high shelf, added what herbs were left, said nothing to himself about the fact that he was doing it carefully. She wouldn't wake for hours yet. It didn't matter if the broth was good. He made it good anyway. At some point in the gray afternoon she turned in her sleep, and her hand slipped from the blanket again, and came to rest against his where it sat on the edge of the cot. He didn't move it. He told himself it was because moving it might wake her. Outside, the snow had not stopped. It had simply decided to be patient. So, apparently, had he. She woke to the smell of broth and the particular silence of a man pretending not to watch her. He was across the room, occupying the high-backed chair with the rigid stillness of someone who had been there a long time and had decided that moving would constitute an admission. His eyes came to her face the moment hers opened, and then, with a precision that was almost impressive, moved to the fire, as though that had been his intention all along. Niamh lay still for a moment and took inventory. Her hands worked. Her feet, when she curled them beneath the blanket, reported back grudgingly. The fever was gone, leaving behind the wrung-out, weightless feeling of a body that had burned through everything it had and was now presenting the bill. Her throat was raw. Her pride was worse. She pushed herself upright. Slowly, and without making any sound that could be construed as difficulty, which required considerable effort. "You should be lying down," he said, still looking at the fire. "You're not looking at me," Niamh said. "How would you know?" A pause. Something shifted in his jaw. "Because you've been awake for 40 seconds and already you're upright. It's a pattern." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. The broth was sitting on the small table beside the cot, still faintly steaming, which meant he had timed it, which meant he had been watching her sleep for long enough to know she was close to waking, which he clearly had no intention of acknowledging. She picked up the broth and drank it without comment. It was good. She didn't say so. "How long?" she asked. 2 days. The storm. Still going. She looked toward the single window. He was right. White pressing against the glass, the occasional shudder of wind against the shutters. The world outside had become theoretical. "I need to leave," Niamh said. "You need to not die," he said. "Those two things are, at present, incompatible. I'll determine what's incompatible with my own survival. Thank you." "You were face down in a snowdrift," he said, and now he did look at her, steady and entirely without apology. "You had stopped moving. Another 20 minutes and determining anything would have been permanently beyond you." It was a factual statement, delivered without cruelty. Somehow that made it worse. Niamh felt the hot flicker of something, not quite embarrassment, closer to fury, move through her chest. "I didn't ask to be brought here," she said. "No," he agreed. "You were unconscious. It limited your input. And I didn't ask to be tended like someone dying." She stopped. He held her gaze with the patience of a man who has made his point and sees no reason to embellish it. The fire shifted between them. Niamh became aware, with some irritation, that her hands had tightened around the empty cup. She set it down. "Thank you," she said, which cost her something and probably showed. He nodded once, as if gratitude were a transaction he preferred to process quickly and move on from. He stood, took the cup, and returned to the hearth without further ceremony. Niamh watched his back and felt, against her better judgment, against every instinct that a life of careful self-preservation had built in her, something adjacent to respect. He hadn't gloated, hadn't softened, hadn't made her feel rescued in the pitying, diminishing way that rescue so often felt. He had simply told her the truth and left her dignity intact. She decided quietly that she disliked him slightly less than she had 5 minutes ago. It was, for Niamh Breslin, practically a declaration. He found her on her knees at 3 in the morning. He had come downstairs for no reason he intended to examine. Not sleep exactly, not hunger, something closer to the restlessness that had plagued him since boyhood, the kind that sent him walking the perimeter of whatever space contained him as though checking the walls were still there. He had expected the main room to be empty. The fire had burned to embers. The cot was. She was kneeling beside it. Not collapsed, not ill, deliberately, precisely kneeling the way a person kneels when kneeling is a practice and not an accident. Her back was straight despite everything her body had been through. Her hands were folded, not loosely but with intention, the knuckles of her right thumb pressed to her lips. Her head was bowed and she was speaking, very quietly, in Latin that moved through the dark room like water finding its level. Rowan stopped in the doorway. He was not a man who prayed. He had been raised in a tradition that distrusted the architecture of it. The beads, the kneeling, the Latin, the whole elaborate machinery of devotion that the Church of Rome had built and called holy and used, in his experience, primarily to justify the things it had already decided to do. His brother's name was somewhere in that machinery, ground down to nothing. He had not forgiven it. He did not intend to. And yet, he stood in the doorway and watched Niamh Breslin pray and found, to his considerable irritation, that he could not make it contemptible. There was nothing performed about it. No audience, no theater. She believed herself alone, which meant this was not faith displayed but faith inhabited, worn privately, the way a scar is worn. Her voice was barely sound. Her shoulders, which in waking hours she held with a careful, load-bearing straightness, had dropped, not in defeat, but in something that looked unexpectedly like relief. As though this were the only place the weight came off. He must have moved. Or perhaps she simply felt the change in the room, the way some people do, attuned to presence the way animals are attuned to weather. Whatever it was, her voice stopped. She didn't startled. She lifted her head slowly, with the composure of someone who had long ago made peace with being watched in vulnerable moments, even if she had not chosen it. She looked at him across the dim room. He looked back. There was a version of this moment in which he said something withering about Rome, something cold and true and well-constructed, the kind of sentence he was good at. The words were there waiting. He had spent years building that particular armory and knew exactly where everything was kept. He said nothing. She rose from her knees without haste, smoothed the blanket across the cot, and sat on its edge. She didn't explain herself. Didn't apologize. Didn't ask what he thought about what he'd seen, which was wise, because he wasn't certain he could have answered accurately. He crossed to the hearth and added 2 logs to the embers. The fire caught slowly, throwing the room back into amber and shadow. "The floor is cold," he said, without turning around. "There's a folded blanket on the shelf above the window. If you insist on kneeling." A silence. "Thank you," she said, in precisely the same tone she'd used the morning before. Like gratitude was a door she kept locked and was only occasionally prepared to open a crack. He went back to bed. Neither of them mentioned it again. The snow made the decision for them both. By morning it had drifted to the window ledge, a clean white wall that rendered the door theoretical and the path down the mountain a memory. Rowan looked at it for a long moment when he rose, then turned back to the room and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say about whether that had already decided. Niamh was sitting at the small table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, already dressed, the letter beside her on the wood. She had not tried to hide it. That, more than anything, was what made him stop. She had been guarding that letter since before she could stand. In her fever she had reached for it before she reached for anything else. And now it sat between them on the table like something she had carried so long the carrying had become indistinguishable from herself, and she was setting it down. "Sit," she said. Not unkindly. He sat. She looked at the letter for a moment. Then she looked at him with the particular expression of someone about to say a true thing they cannot take back. "My father was Bishop Cormac Breslin," she said. "He died 18 months ago in a church prison in Rome, officially of natural causes. He was 53 and had never been ill a day in his life." She paused. "The letter is his. He smuggled it out through a lay brother 6 weeks before he died. It contains the names of 3 Vatican officials who fabricated the charges against him, and the name of the man who ordered it done." Rowan said nothing. She continued. "My father had discovered that a significant sum of money, papal money, money intended for the poor parishes of the western counties, had been systematically redirected. 4 years. The man responsible held enough authority in Rome that exposure would have been catastrophic. So instead of being exposed, he exposed my father first. Had him arrested on charges of heresy and private scandal." Her jaw tightened briefly. "The charges were an architecture of lies. My father died before he could prove it. But he wrote down everything he knew. Every name. Every transaction. Every date." She touched the edge of the letter. "And the name at the center of it," she said, "is Cardinal Aldrich Voss." The fire. The snow against the glass. The name sitting between them in the silence like a coal dropped onto the floor. Rowan had gone very still. Not the stillness of a man thinking. The stillness of a man who has stopped thinking entirely because something has reached across time and hit him somewhere old and unhealed. Niamh watched his face. She had learned in 3 days to read its small movements. There were not many. This one, this absolute arrested quiet, was new. "You know that name," she said. It was not a question. He stood. Not abruptly, but with the controlled movement of a man who needs to put space between himself and what he's just heard before he does something irreversible with his expression. He went to the window. Looked at the white wall of snow with his back to her, both hands flat on the sill. "Aldrich Voss," he said very quietly, "signed the letter that declared my brother's death a suicide." A beat. It was not a suicide. The fire breathed. Outside, the storm continued its patient, indifferent work. Neither of them spoke for a long time. When Niamh finally reached across the table and pushed the letter toward his side, it was the most significant thing she had ever given anyone. They both understood that without saying so. The letter stayed on the table between them for the rest of the morning, and neither of them touched it, and neither of them left it alone. Rowan had pulled the second chair to the table, the first time he had sat across from her rather than at a calculated distance, and they worked through it together with the focused, joyless efficiency of 2 people who have discovered they are building the same case from opposite ends. Niamh knew the church's internal architecture. The titles, the hierarchies, the precise language of Vatican correspondence that sounded like doctrine and functioned like weaponry. Rowan knew the political geography, which Scottish lords owed Rome favors, which English parliamentarians had been quietly courted, which pressure points, if struck correctly, would make powerful men prefer exposure to continued resistance. They were, it turned out, extraordinarily well matched for a war neither had planned to fight with the other. By midday they had a list. Names, dates. The chain of correspondence Niamh's father had documented with the meticulous care of a man who had known he was building evidence for a trial he might not live to attend. Rowan had found paper in the desk drawer and written in a hand that was spare and precise, crossing out nothing, his notations bracketing her father's words like a barrister building a case. Niamh had watched his handwriting and thought, involuntarily, that it looked like him, efficient, undecorated, and more legible than it had any right to be. She stopped thinking about his handwriting. "The nuncio in Edinburgh," Rowan said. "He's the pressure point. Voss needs his cooperation to maintain the fiction on this side of the water. Remove his cooperation and the whole structure loses a wall." "The nuncio won't receive me," Niamh said. "I'm the disgraced bishop's daughter. I walked into that room, I'd be in a church cell before I finished the sentence. He'll receive me." She looked at him. "You're Protestant," she said. "I'm a duke," he said, with the flat simplicity of a man stating a geographical fact. "In Edinburgh that outranks most things, including, on several historical occasions, God." Niamh thought about saying something about that. She decided against it. They'll call it interference. A Protestant lord meddling in church affairs. I won't be meddling, he said. There's an ancient canon right, ducal right of ecclesiastical petition, hasn't been invoked in 2 centuries, that allows a titled lord to formally petition for the release of church documentation pertaining to deaths on his land or bloodline. My brother died on Caelmore land. Voss signed the letter. The documentation pertains. He paused. It's their own law. I'll use it like a blade and smile while I do it. The fire had burned low again. Neither of them had noticed. Niamh was looking at him with an expression she wasn't entirely in control of. Something between assessment and something warmer that she was working to classify as admiration and leave it there. He was looking back at her with an expression that suggested he was conducting a similar exercise and finding it similarly inconclusive. The cabin was very quiet. Why, she said. Not the practical why, she understood the practical why. The other one. He was still for a moment. Then, simply, because my brother deserved better than a lie on a piece of paper. And so did your father. It was the most he had said about anything that mattered. Niamh looked at the list between them, then back at him, and made a decision that had nothing to do with strategy. All right, Duke of Caelmore, she said quietly. Let's take them apart. They heard the horse before they saw it. A single set of hooves on the track below the cabin, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had not considered the possibility of being unwelcome. Rowan was at the window before the sound fully registered, one hand pulling back the edge of the shutter, his body angled so that he could see out without being seen. An old habit, Niamh noted. The kind you didn't acquire in peacetime. She crossed to stand behind him and looked over his shoulder. The rider was dressed in the dark traveling clothes of a private man, which meant nothing. Church agents rarely announced themselves with vestments outside of Rome. What announced him was the way he rode. Straight-backed, deliberate, scanning the tree lane with the systematic attention of someone conducting a search rather than completing a journey. There was a second figure behind him, half visible through the pines. Waiting. They never sent one alone if one was enough. They found the trail from the convent, Niamh said. Her voice was steady. Her hand, where it had come to rest against the window frame beside his, was not. How long have they been looking? Since the morning I left, I expect. She paused. They'll have spoken to the village. Someone will have seen you carry me up the mountain. Rowan let the shutter fall back. He turned from the window with the expression of a man rapidly reorganizing his priorities and finding the new arrangement clarifying rather than troubling. He looked at Niamh with a directness that had ceased, somewhere over the past 2 days, to feel like assessment. The letter, he said. She already had it. She had taken it from the table the moment she heard the hooves, folded it twice, and pressed it inside the lining of her dress with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been hiding things in plain sight for years. She showed him her empty hands. Something moved briefly in his face. Not quite a smile. The architecture of one. He took his coat from the hook by the door. What are you doing? She asked. Going down to meet him. Rowan. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. They both noticed. Neither acknowledged it. He's a church agent on a Scottish mountain in the jurisdiction of the Duke of Caelmore, Rowan said, buttoning the coat with unhurried hands. He has no authority here. He has no legal standing here. What he has is a horse and an instruction from a man whose reach ends at the border. He looked up. My name is the Wall, Niamh. Let me be the wall. She wanted to argue. She had several arguments prepared and they were good ones. She looked at his face and understood with some frustration that the arguments were unnecessary. Not because he was dismissing her, but because he was already several steps ahead of the situation and the steps were sound. She hated that she trusted it. He opened the door. Cold air struck the room like a verdict. Stay inside, he said. Stay away from the windows. If you hear raised voices, it means it's going well. He paused on the threshold. If you hear nothing, leave through the back and take the eastern path into the tree lane. Don't stop. Then he stepped out into the white and pulled the door closed behind him and walked down the mountain toward the rider with the unhurried, absolute confidence of a man on his own land who has never once considered the possibility of retreat. Niamh stood in the middle of the cabin, the letter pressed flat against her ribs, and watched through the shutter crack as the Duke of Caelmore went to war on her behalf without raising his voice. It was, she thought, the most frightening thing she had ever found attractive. He left at first light, 2 days later, when the track down the mountain had hardened enough to hold a horse. He did not make a production of it. He was dressed and booted before Niamh woke, the saddlebag already packed with the letter's copied contents. The original stayed with her, because putting both versions on the same horse was the kind of optimism neither of them could afford. He had spent the previous evening making a second transcription in his spare, precise hand, witnessed by no one, which would have to be enough. She was sitting up in the cot when he came back inside for his coat, her hair loose, the blanket around her shoulders, watching him with the particular expression she wore when she had decided not to say what she was thinking. He had learned to recognize it. It looked like composure and functioned as its opposite. "The agent in the valley," she said, "won't move without instruction, and instruction from Voss takes a week to arrive from Rome." He pulled on his coat. "By which time this will already be done." "You sound certain." "I am certain. No one has invoked that right in 2 centuries, Rowan." "Which means no one has had cause to test whether it still holds." He picked up his gloves from the table. "I intend to find out." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached under the edge of the mattress and produced a small folded paper he hadn't seen her write, which meant she had written it while he slept, which meant she had been planning this moment longer than she had let on. "My father had a contact in the nuncio's household," she said. "A lay secretary. He is a good man who has been frightened into silence for 2 years. His name is on that paper." A pause. "He'll know the procedure. He'll know which room, which entrance, which hour of the day the nuncio is least fortified by his own self-importance." Rowan took the paper. He looked at it, then at her. "You were going to do this yourself," he said. It was not an accusation. "Yes," she said simply. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket and said nothing further about it, which she understood was its own form of respect. The ride to Edinburgh took the better part of 2 days. He arrived mud-spattered and unannounced, which was deliberate. A duke who sends word ahead gives the other side time to construct defenses. He sent one note to the lay secretary, received a reply within the hour, and presented himself at a side entrance of the nuncio's residence on a grey Edinburgh morning with the copied letter under his arm and the expression of a man who has already won and is here only as a courtesy. The nuncio received him in a wood-panelled room that smelled of incense and institutional authority. He was a small, precise man with the wary eyes of someone accustomed to managing the ambitions of others, and he looked at Rowan with the particular displeasure reserved for problems that have arrived inconveniently dressed. Rowan stated his case without preamble. The ducal right. The bloodline clause. His brother's death, Voss's signature. The documented falsification now laid in precise copies across the nuncio's own desk. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. When he finished, the nuncio sat back and called it an outrage. Called it interference. Called it an abuse of a dormant instrument by a man with no standing in matters of holy jurisdiction. Rowan let him finish. Then he said, quietly, that the instrument was Roman canon law, written by Rome, signed by a pope 3 centuries dead, and never formally repealed, and that he would be delighted to test its validity before the Scottish civil courts if the nuncio preferred a more public venue. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. The nuncio looked at the papers. Looked at Rowan. Looked at the papers again with the expression of a man watching an exit close. He called it done. He saw her from the bottom of the track. She was standing outside the cabin in the flat white light of late afternoon, a small bag at her feet, her cloak fastened, her hair pinned back with the neat finality of someone who has settled their accounts and is ready to move. She was looking at the tree-lane with an expression he recognized. Not longing, not fear, but the forward-facing stillness of a person calculating the next necessary thing. She had been doing it since the moment he pulled her from the snow. He understood now that it was how she had survived. His horse found the last of the track and she heard the hooves and turned. She looked at him for a long moment. Then at the bag at her feet. Then back at him, with something in her face that was not quite guilt and not quite relief and not quite either. "It's done," he said before she could speak. Something moved through her then. Not the dramatic collapse of someone rescued, nothing so simple. It was quieter than that. A long breath. The almost imperceptible drop of shoulders that had been braced for 18 months against a weight that was no longer there. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again the calculation was gone from her face and something rawer had taken its place, something she did not bother to conceal, which told him more than anything she had said in 8 days. "The nuncio," she said, "will be writing to Rome before the week is out. Voss will be recalled. The documentation stands." He paused. "Your father's name will be cleared. It will take time, and it will be handled quietly, because that is how institutions manage their shame, but it will be done. I have his signature on that." Niamh nodded once. The rawness in her face did not recede. She looked at the bag at her feet, then bent and picked it up, and he understood that she was leaving. That this had always been the shape of it in her mind. Survive the storm, clear her father's name, disappear into whatever came next. She had not planned a next that included him because she had not allowed herself to. He dismounted. She stopped. He looped the reins over the post by the cabin door and turned to face her, and then, without particular ceremony, without calculation, he went down on one knee in the snow. Not with a ring. Not with a title. Not with any of the formal machinery that the word proposal usually dragged behind it. Just a man on one knee in a snowfield, looking up at a woman who had survived everything the world had aimed at her, with an expression that had nothing in it she could call performance. "I am not asking you to be a duchess," he said. "I have no interest in a duchess. I'm asking whether you would consider staying as yourself, because yourself is what I—" He stopped briefly, and the pause was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. "Is what I find I am entirely unwilling to watch walk into those trees." Niamh stood in the snow with her bag in her hand and looked down at him. For once in her life, no one was telling her what the answer should be. No convent wall, no church instruction, no obligation dressed as duty and presented as choice. Just a question openly asked, by a man still kneeling in the cold, waiting without pressure for whatever she decided. She set the bag down. "You'll need to stand up," she said. "I'm not answering a man in the snow." He stood. She looked at him for a long, unhurried moment, this cold-eyed, warm-handed, insufferably capable man who had pulled her from a snowdrift and remade the architecture of her life without once asking for her gratitude. "Ask me again," she said quietly. "Properly. On your feet." So he did. "Here you go." And that is where we leave them. Niamh Breslin, the bishop's daughter, the convent runaway, the woman who carried the truth sewn against her skin through a killing Highland snowstorm. Standing in the snow on her own 2 feet, making the first free choice of her life. And Rowan Calloway, the Duke of Caelmore, the cold-eyed Protestant lord who pulled a stranger from a snowdrift and somewhere between the fever and the fire and the letters and the war they built together, forgot how to let her go. No ballroom. No grand announcement. No church blessing, which, all things considered, felt appropriate. Just 2 people standing in the white silence of a Scottish mountain, with the storm finally done. The laughter, when it came, began there. If this story kept you company today, if you found yourself leaning in somewhere around chapter 3, or holding your breath when Rowan walked down that mountain alone, then this one was for you. Stories like this one live or die by the people who show up for them, so if you enjoyed it, please give this video a like. It takes 2 seconds and it tells us that this kind of storytelling is worth surfacing for someone else who needs it tonight. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because there are more stories coming. More storms, more stubborn heroines, more cold-eyed men who don't know what's about to happen to them. You won't want to miss what comes next. And if you've been here from the beginning, thank you. Genuinely. You're the reason the next story gets told. Until then, stay warm.